We're back. I'm a happy man because while the camera was shut off, Clint Baker and I were talking about J.C. Higginbotham.
Yeah, well, JC was another guy. He was from the Jenkins Orphanage Band, and I believe he was kind of a prodigy trombonist, virtuoso. I always think of him as being a gut bucket virtuoso because his playing style is very old style gut bucket. He had a shouting. He was like Charlie Green, had that beautiful shouting trombone sound and wasn't afraid to make his tone rough to really do it. But he could play with velocity that's amazing. And I think that he and Red Allen were the best two foils for each other in those 1929 records because Allen was such an avant-garde player, even in the 20s. And he was while Red was going off and doing all of his crazy crossbar, crazy polyrhythmic, advanced harmony stuff, basically playing out in the 1920s. You had Higginbotham, who could play extremely fast velocity and played pretty much straight on the beat. So those two guys together are magical. I was telling Mr. Steinman that I've been listening to Bill Harris, the trombonist who was really popular with Woody Herman's band and into the 50s. And I had a revelation today that Bill Harris's style was heavily based on J.C. Higginbotham, which is an interesting thing because almost every trombonist of the 1930s and early 40s was a Jack Teagarden devotee. So to hear somebody going down that path so committed to that path so much as Harris was is pretty amazing to me. I've always, I had never really thought about that style that Harris played much. And it came to me after hearing Northwest Passage for the 20th time because my son was listening to Davy Tuff with, Riley was listening to Davy Tuff with Woody Herman. The jazz education never stops. In our house, it's 365, 24 hours, 365 days a year, 7 days a week. It's always going on. So anyway, yeah, it was kind of an interesting thing. I don't know how I could talk about Higginbotham all the time. His ability to play with speed and kind of I don't know. I'm kind of blanking on this one. My brain, I think.
Well, I want to say something about him. Years ago, there was a Decca reissue of mid-30s Lewis sides, and our hero Dan Morgenstern wrote the notes, and the record of "You're a Lucky Guy." I've quoted this back to Dan. Higgy takes a meaty break. There's like a 4-bar break, and it's as perfectly constructed as anything you could want. He was not just assertive. He was in some way. His solos had a classical shape with all that power as well.
No, I think so too. I was thinking that's a good. There's so many solos. Like when I started thinking of Higginbotham, my brain fails the words and the sounds of the records come to my mind in kind of this just mass of records I've heard because I think I've probably listened to Higginbotham more than any trombonist of that era because of my love of the Louis Russell Band, which I still think is a pinnacle of proto swing music. I think that band particularly was really the proto swing band. They brought the elements of New Orleans jazz to New York in a way that other bands didn't do it as blatantly, and they played really, their ensembles in the rhythm section particularly. But I was thinking about Higginbotham with Armstrong. It was you reminded me on the Fleischmann's Yeast recordings. There's a great redo of the arrangement of Them Their Eyes. It's the same arrangement they were using in 31, which had Preston Jackson on it, who's another great trombonist. And that arrangement, for those of us who are devotees of Armstrong, know that whole 1931 Armstrong arrangement by heart. We can sing it. Michael and I could sit here and start from the beginning and sing it to the end. But they arranged the really funny thing about that record is there's 2 trombonists on the band at that point. This is like 30. What year is it? 36? Is it? It's
the Yeast would have been
36,
37.
So they're pretty late, yeah. And he's still playing that.
Excuse me. All factual mistakes here are mine.
No, mine too. But anyway, the Fleischmann's Yeast, there's an air shot, and when I first heard, it was like they're playing the 1931 arrangement, except just at lightning speed, much faster than the original. And Jimmy Archie is also on this section, so we get a little bit of Jimmy Archie. And then Higginbotham plays the most exquisite 8 bars of blues, high register, blistering trombone. There aren't many guys who could come in and grab attention from Louis like Higginbotham could do. And I expect that's probably the reason why Armstrong wasn't a major soloist in Louis' band, because Louis was conscious of that stuff. And Higginbotham could just totally wipes it out in 8 bars, And it's true about your things. His breaks are always perfectly executed and always, exciting and have a shape to them, And he had some tricks too. He could play really fast, like he could play, really fast. Like that was a chromatic scale. The other thing he could do, I can't really do it, and I don't really know how, I think Dave Sager probably knows how to do it better than anybody. I've heard him do it. But he does this thing where it's just a lip trill, except you go down chromatically. I suspect that it might even be more complicated than that, but it's beyond my pay grade to figure it out. I don't know. It's pretty good. Pretty good to think about that. That's the problem, is like it's hard for me to talk about Higginbotham now that I'm doing it, because it's all sonic memories,
He's instantly recognizable. He's instantly memorable. I want to go away from Higginbotham for a second. Something you brought up, and I don't know if I'm right, but it seems to me that as the trombonists of this skein go on, they're also increasing the range in which the instrument is comfortable.
Oh, that's very
true. Whether that's a Lewis thing, but that the earlier, except for the thing you mentioned of Charlie Green's, in the early 20s, these guys are sticking to a more moderate register.
Yeah.
And you get to Higginbotham, you get to someone we haven't talked about yet, Dickie Wells. You get to Preston Jackson. There's a broadening of register, if I'm using.
No, I think that's true, and I think that comes a lot from. Although one must never underestimate the old men of New Orleans, like Horry, who could actually play pretty high. In fact, Horry's great. One of the most amazing things he did is on Perdido Street Blues from the Johnny Dodds, I think, the Boot Blacks to New Orleans Wanderers. He plays high notes too, but yeah, the usable range I think comes also from the fact that a lot of the orchestrations as the late 20s went along, particularly the hot orchestrations, that started incorporating Armstrong's ideas, Louis' ideas, the hot phrasing. I think that the trombone parts start getting higher, and I can see this in the dance. I have a huge collection of dance band arrangements from the 19-teens, aughts and teens, all the way up to the 40s. And you can see the trombone parts getting more, covering more range. And I think that it was also, I think a lot of what people have to understand about the proto-swing era is how Armstrong's vocabulary gets orchestrated so much. I think that most people who study this music know that. But also the harmonizations get tighter, and the trombones role as being an instrument that almost plays like counter melodies, which goes back to the band era, starts changing as to being part of the trumpet section and the brass section. And a lot of the times the orchestrations lead the way because the parts are high, like high B flats, high Cs, and all that kind of stuff. So you see that kind of stuff coming up. So I think that there was a push, but I do think that the dexterity of Armstrong and his whole thing really affected that part of it.
That is my cell phone that I'm going to ignore.
There we go.
It will stop. My discovery, which is not perhaps as important as yours about Higginbotham and Bill Harris, talking about orchestrated Armstrong, is that a number of years ago I realized that the phrase Lewis sings on Stardust, oh memory, becomes a bassy riff.
Yeah,
And it's such a cliche by the time it gets to 36, 37, but it's there.
You know what? I don't even know. I really don't even know what cliches are. I mean, there's a part of me that is cliche impervious. So
cliche is not an insult to me.
I know, and that's my thing. It's like when I lead bands and I play swing music. I mean, I have a kind of a split life. I play a lot of New Orleans jazz and a lot of swing music, and I have a whole vocabulary of riffs. And I know some of the riffs that I play are would be considered kind of overdone, but hey, they work. Particularly when you got a dance floor full of people. So I'm there.
I will digress once more, and then I have somebody I want to ask you about who you mentioned. When I'm sitting at a gig and the band is doing Dig-a-Dig-a-Doo, and they launch into the Crazy Capers riff, it increases my happiness exponentially.
Well, me too. So, I'm guilty of that myself.
That's not guilty.
I'd rather play Crazy Capers than Dig-a-Dig-a-Doo any day.
Well, that's the mark of a spiritually educated
Well,
man.
and because Benny Carter was, genius is everywhere with Benny Carter.
Yes, and just by digression 6, sometime, if you haven't heard it, audience, there's a Julia Lee recording of Crazy World where Vic Dickinson and Benny Carter are both playing trombone, which is one of the marvels of Western civilization. You mentioned Preston Jackson before. Now, he's New Orleanian.
Kind of, yeah. He was mostly Chicagoan in a lot of ways. Preston was a student of Henri Dutray. And Henri Dutray doesn't, talk about it underrated. He was the trombonist with the King Oliver Creole Jazz Band, for those of you who know such things. He was not a tailgate trombonist in the traditional sense, although he was a New Orleans player. I can't remember his exact educational pathway in New Orleans, but I suspect he was taking lessons from, different people than Ori and those other guys were. And he was quite kind of a middle to high note specialist for that time. In fact, if you want to blow your mind, and if you like trombone playing, everybody talks about Armstrong and Oliver on the original Creole Jazz Band records. But if you just go and listen to what Dutray's playing, it'll blow your mind, because his part playing, there isn't any precedent for what he's doing. There isn't. It's not like Kid Ory. It's not like Roy Palmer. And the reason was that he didn't hear tailgate trombone parts. He wanted to play cello parts. And like I referenced earlier, I have a huge collection of orchestrations. And particularly if you go back to the time when Dutray would have been coming up, let's say in the late aughts and mostly the teens, if you were to pick up a ragtime orchestration, if you looked at the trombone part, a lot of the times the trombone parts are boring. They're like oompa parts. But the cello parts are cool. They have counter melodies, and then they're like a euphonium part in a concert band or a military band. So Dutray, because he had a little bit more technique maybe than some of these other guys, would take those parts, and he'd always play the cello parts. And if you listen to his part playing in the Oliver band, his parts are more like counter melodies than they are like tailgate style. And there's a good way to contrast it, because Dutray and Dodds quit the band. They went on strike or something like that for a certain time during 1923, and Ed Atkins and Jimmy Noon take over on the Oliver. And Ed Atkins was a great trombonist, but he played more in the tailgate style, like Ori or like Roy Palmer. And you can tell very quickly that Dutray is not there, because the parts are totally different. Complete contrast. Dutray also was quite facile at the high register of the trombone, and Preston Jackson took lessons from him in Chicago, and Preston Jackson was his #1 student. And Jackson played very similarly to Dutray. And all you need to do is listen to Plantation Joys by, I think it's Louis Russell's Hot 8 or one of those early Louis Russell band things. And you couldn't tell, one couldn't tell if one didn't know that it wasn't Dutray. He completely mastered his teacher's style of playing. and went on to play into the throughout the history of jazz into the era of Preservation Hall, and he toured with Preservation Hall, and he gave one of your heroes and mine, Jeff Hamilton, a trombone mouthpiece. So Jeff Hamilton is known as a drummer and a pianist, but Jeff has a mouthpiece that Preston Jackson gave him, and he plays it. Whenever Jeff plays the trombone, go up and ask him about his Preston Jackson mouthpiece. So Preston had a long career, and his style of playing was very different, maybe more in the style of the New York guys than what we think of as a New Orleans style.
His name came up in my head because there are recordings, and I think they're from Decca's New Orleans jazz album of 1940.
Yes.
Whether it's New Orleans Hopscotch Blues.
Yes, I know that
where
record.
he plays astonishingly.
Yes, that's a good record. And that's the Dutray stuff right there. It's all right there in beautiful, late 30s fidelity.
Yes.
And you and I know what that means. So yeah, I think I ought to take a break. Is that cool?
That's fine.
I've